should recognize that freedom of speech in the United States, though it is protected to a very high degree, has not been protected historically. That's a recent development. And in fact, it's a development that came substantially out of the activist movement. If you look at there is the Bill of Rights, which says that the government, part of the constitutional system, which First Amendment, it says that the government can't prevent speech, but it doesn't say it can't punish it. So the First Amendment was never understood, in fact, doesn't really permit freedom of speech. It says, for example, that the government can't stop a newspaper from publishing an article, but it can throw them in jail if they did publish it. That's not protection of freedom of speech. And in fact, it wasn't until the 20th century that freedom of speech cases actually reached the high courts. The law is basically what the courts decide, not what's written on paper. And the Supreme Court began to address freedom of speech issues actually during the First World War. And the famous statements supporting freedom of speech were dissents. They were dissenting opinions. Later they were recognized as important. And in fact, if you look at those dissenting opinions, they were nothing to write home about. For example, one of the main ones was during the First World War, the Shank case. It was I think a Jewish tailor or something who published some pamphlets criticizing the war. During the war, the First World War, it became practically fascist in the United States. I mean, the Boston Symphony Orchestra couldn't play Beethoven, let's say. You couldn't mention anything German. There's massive hatred was created of anything loosely related to the German enemy. Eugene Debs, the leading labor figure in the United States, also a presidential candidate, the Socialist Party candidate, he was thrown in jail for giving a talk in which he in which he told working people, look, this is not your war, it's an imperialist war. Working people don't have a state that they have to serve. And he urged people to think about their constitutional right not to bear arms if they chose not to. He didn't urge any illegal activity. He was thrown into jail. And he was, after the war, when there was a kind of a general amnesty, he was kept in jail. He was bitterly hated by the progressives. Woodrow Wilson hated him particularly and kept him in jail. And this was the atmosphere. In the midst of that, there was a Supreme Court dissent in which Oliver Wendell Holmes made a famous dissent in the Schenck case and said that this tailor who published a pamphlet questioning the war shouldn't be, that issues of freedom of speech arose, he said. He nevertheless voted with the majority on punishing him. So it was a dissent in the sense that he raised the question of freedom of speech, but nevertheless said that these actions had to be punished. Well, over the years it sort of broadened a little bit, but then also went backwards in many ways. But it wasn't until the 1960s that there were strong Supreme Court judgments on freedom of speech. And the first major ones came out of the Civil Rights Movement and that's not unusual. In the first major Supreme Court statement affirming freedom of speech was in 1964. It was Times v. Sullivan, if you want to look it up. What happened was that the New York Times published an ad by the Civil Rights Movement, Martin Luther King, which condemned an state of Alabama sheriff, a particularly brutal, racist sheriff who was doing kind of horrible things, and they ran an ad condemning him. The state of Alabama sued the New York Times for what's called seditious libel. Practically every country in the world, I suspect Holland too, I haven't checked, has a principle of seditious libel. Seditious libel means you cannot assault the state with words. And truth is no defense. Truth makes it a worse crime, because then it's an even greater assault. As far as I know, every country I've looked at still has that law. Britain, Canada, you can check here. And that's like a core attack on freedom of speech. It means the state, the king, the state, whatever it is cannot be attacked with words. Well, that was, and the United States had it too. It was shot down by the Supreme Court in 1964. So you can assault the state with words. You can criticize the state freely, and that means any state authority. And there were other cases, and finally in 1969, there was the most important case, which said that, essentially concluded that speech should be free up to participation in imminent criminal activity. So, for example, if you and I go into a store and you have a gun and we're planning to rob it, and I say, shoot, that's not protected speech. But anything kind of up to that should be protected speech. And this is very relevant to the case that you mentioned, because the case in question was the Ku Klux Klan, a vicious, racist organization carrying out lynching of blacks and so on. And they were the ones who were protected by this, that their speech should be protected up to participation in imminent criminal acts. As far as I know, that's the strongest protection of freedom of speech that exists anywhere. Actually, it's even beyond what the courts are now willing to accept. There are also attacks on freedom of speech. So it's by no means a victory that's won forever. The worst attack is under Obama. It's a case that you should look up if you're interested, a case that the Obama administration brought to the court. It was argued by Obama's latest Supreme Court appointment, Justice Kagan, and they won. The Obama administration won with the support of the reactionary justices. It's a case against a group called the Humanitarian Law Project, which was giving legal advice to a group that's on the government's terrorist list, the PKK, a Turkish group. They were just giving them legal advice, saying, here's the kind of things you can do. The court decided that, and the Obama administration insisted, that even verbal engagement with a group that's on the terrorist list, for example, if you tell them, I think you ought to turn to nonviolent activities, that's criminal. That's material support for terrorism. And that's a real attack on freedom of speech, a major attack. For example, I could be charged. Jimmy Carter could be charged. Plenty of people could be charged. Anyone who involved in any way with a group that the government calls terrorist, anything you do, like tell them to keep the nonviolent activities or say, here are your rights or whatever, that's criminal. That's a major assault on freedom of speech, and that's Obama. And what makes it worse, and isn't even discussed, is that the terrorist list itself is utterly illegitimate by any standards of the last couple of centuries. The government just says, you're on the terrorist list. Nothing you can do about it. And no judicial review, no evidence, no nothing. Just the government says you're on the terrorist list.